The Standard Oil Company was one of the most successful companies to ever exist in the United States. This company, led by John D. Rockefeller himself, one of the greatest businessmen, if not the greatest of all time, was able to control nearly an entire industry with it. If you buy gasoline in the United States, chances are you have bought products from one of the many companies that Standard Oil would become. Standard Oil would be so big and so successful that the US government had to split them up. But where did it all start? Cleveland, Ohio. That's right, Cleveland, Ohio. Detroit had cars, Pittsburgh had steel, and Cleveland had oil. More specifically, oil refining. But Cleveland isn't really thought of as an oil city today. Why? A combination of factors and events would lead to a once great oil empire to essentially disappear, even though it was the birthplace of one of the biggest companies ever. This is the lost oil empire of Cleveland, Ohio. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil began in Cleveland, Ohio in 1870. Just over a decade before, in not too distant western Pennsylvania, oil would be discovered at the Drake Well, roughly 100 miles away, in what would become known as the Appalachian Basin. It would be Ohio and Pennsylvania that would be the first large-scale producing oil states in the United States, producing off that basin in the decades to come. That's right, before Alaska, before the Gulf, and even before Texas, Pennsylvania and Ohio were the center of the oil industry. Large-scale oil drilling and pumping would need large-scale refining capacity, and given that Cleveland was one of the few large cities within 100 miles of the oil, Rockefeller and a few partners would establish Standard Oil in 1870 after a few years in the industry previously. Already having a major refinery in Cleveland, Rockefeller and Standard Oil would buy out almost all refining capacity in Cleveland in the early 1870s. And it wouldn't stop there. Over the next decade, Rockefeller would buy out almost all the competition in the United States and would be in possession of nearly all of the U.S. refining capacity in it. This Cleveland-based company had quickly become an oil empire, growing to 30 refineries in Cleveland alone. While Standard Oil would be based in New York City by the mid-1880s, it was Cleveland where it all began. And before continuing, I will take you to the first corporate office and refinery number 1 of the Standard Oil Company. So now we're in downtown Cleveland, and this is the Cushing building. This was the first corporate headquarters of the Standard Oil Company. John D. Rockefeller himself worked here, and in roughly 100 years' time, the company would go from this to this. And we'll get into that building right there in a second, but it just shows you how much changed in terms of the growth of this company. All right, so this is it. Standard Oil Company Refinery number 1. This is one of the only things remaining of it. You can see right here, if you look closely, the Standard Oil logo there still remains. This building appears to be vacated, and there are a couple of other buildings over there. I don't know if that was part of the Standard Oil buildings or not, but I'm going to show you here the flats where all of the buildings and oil tanks and everything from Standard Oil once were. This is where the Standard Oil refinery was. The buildings and tanks you see today are not associated with Standard Oil, but the building we were at is right over there, and this area of the flats would have been where Standard Oil refinery number 1 was. Standard Oil would continue its dominance going into the 20th century. However, by 1911, the U.S. government finally had enough. Over concerns of monopolization in the oil industry, Standard Oil would be broken up into 33 separate companies, 9 of which in particular would become large oil companies, several of which are major players in the oil business today. Chains such as Marathon, Exxon, Chevron, Pennzoil, and Phillips 66, along with others, are all successors in some form of the original Standard Oil founded in Cleveland, being the headquarters of its own division, the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. Despite this breakup, Cleveland would still be a major oil player. Sohio would grow over the decades to 1,000 gas stations under its name and to 8,000 under its control by the 1980s. With such a large presence, the successor to the original Standard Oil Company would have such a large presence in Cleveland in the 1980s that in 1981, one of the biggest projects in Cleveland history would be commissioned, and that would be the Sohio Building. The Sohio Building would be built in the early 1980s as Cleveland's second tallest building at a height of 658 feet and at a cost of $200 million, roughly $700 million in today's dollars. This was particularly significant as at this point in time, Cleveland was experiencing major population losses, losing over 20% of its population in the 1970s alone, and over 340,000 people since 1950. The only issue? British Petroleum, or BP, was a major stakeholder at this point in time, and were just about ready to finish buying out Sohio completely by the mid-1980s, which would be around the time the skyscraper was ready to open. In 1987, 2 years after the skyscraper was finished, BP would have full ownership of Sohio, and Sohio would no longer exist, with BP slowly phasing out the branding to their own gas stations shortly after. Despite this, Cleveland would still have a major place in the oil industry through much of the 1990s, as BP's North American division would have its headquarters at the Sohio Building, now called the BP Building. This would not last, however, as BP would ditch Cleveland for Chicago, moving its division headquarters there in 1998 at a cost of 1,000 jobs to Cleveland. And in this clip, I will show you that former headquarters. So what we have here is originally the Sohio Building. It was built in the 1980s as the headquarters of the Sohio division of the Standard Oil Company, and it was built during a time when Cleveland was losing a lot of population. So when this went up in the early half of the 80s, it was kind of a big deal, and it was supposed to actually be taller than Terminal Tower right there, but the city didn't want that. So it ended up being a little bit lower. But funny thing is, in the next decade, Key Tower would be built and ended up being taller than both of them anyway. So this building opened in 1985, but Sohio would be acquired by BP just 2 years later. So this skyscraper never really lived up to its potential as the major headquarters of an oil company, because BP just occupied it as an office for about 10 years, and then they just ended up selling it. And this building just sold last year for only $55 million. It was built for $200 million, so it's lost a ton of value. So now Cleveland's powerful oil empire is no more. However, what began in Cleveland has no doubt left a mark on the oil industry like no other. Remnants of the wealth Rockefeller and Standard Oil left behind can still be found within the city today, particularly in Rockefeller Park and the Cleveland Cultural Gardens that were built on it, which would never have existed if Rockefeller didn't donate the land. Even though he didn't develop these gardens, they are a lasting reminder of Cleveland's once great wealth. The oil industry may be gone, but the remnants remain. Thank you for watching.